That night, in the teeth of a Montana blizzard, Elias made the gravest mistake a man can make. Through the swirling snow and darkness, his flashlight caught the glowing eyes of a wild bobcat standing over his injured dog. Seeing only a predator about to kill, Elias didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and pulled the trigger, but as the echo faded and he scrambled down into the ravine, the truth brought him to his knees. The cat wasn't eating his dog. She was fighting off a pack of coyotes to protect him. He had just shot his best friend's guardian angel. The silence of the Montana high country isn't empty. It is heavy. It presses against the windows of the cabin like a physical weight, composed of snow, pine needles, and memories that refuse to fade. For Elias Thorne, silence was usually a comfort, a blanket he pulled over himself after the world took too much away. But tonight, the silence felt predatory. Elias sat in his worn leather armchair, the stuffing exposed on the left armrest where his fingers had worried the material for years. At his feet lay Rusty, a golden retriever whose muzzle had long since turned the color of sugar and snow. The dog was 12 years old, his hips stiff, his eyes carrying that milky film of age, but his tail still thumped a steady rhythm against the floorboards whenever Elias shifted. Rusty was more than a pet. He was a living artifact. He was the last breathing thing that Elias's son, Lucas, had loved before the deployment that didn't have a return trip. "Take care of him, Dad," Lucas had said at the Missoula airport, hand on the dog's head. "He gets scared of the thunder." Outside, the wind was picking up, whistling through the gaps in the log walls. The weatherman on the radio had been warning of a clipper, a fast-moving storm front dropping down from Chattahoochee. The temperature was already plummeting, turning the slush on County Road 4 into a sheet of black ice. "All right, old man," Elias grunted, standing up. His knees popped, a sound that seemed loud in the quiet room. "Last let out before the snow hits." He grabbed his heavy canvas coat and opened the back door. The cold air hit him like a slap, smelling of ozone and wet earth. Rusty lumbered up, stretching with a groan, and trotted out into the yard. Elias watched him go, his mind drifting to the broken latch on the perimeter fence he had meant to fix since Tuesday. He had secured it with baling wire, thinking it would hold until the weekend. It was the kind of small procrastination that a man forgives himself for, right up until the moment he can't. The wind gusted, a sudden violent shriek that tore through the pines. Down by the road, the old gate groaned. The baling wire snapped. The gate swung open, banging rhythmically against the post. Rusty, confused by the noise and perhaps scenting a deer driven low by the storm, perked his ears. He didn't bark. He just moved with a sudden, surprising burst of energy toward the open gate, toward the road. "Rusty! No!" Elias yelled, stepping off the porch. "Stay!" But the wind swallowed his voice. The dog was already through the gap, his golden coat a fading smudge against the darkening tree line. Then came the sound. It wasn't a screech of brakes. There was no time for brakes. It was a dull, sickening thud, heavy metal impacting solid mass, followed by the whine of an engine accelerating, not stopping. The taillights of a pickup truck flared red in the distance, weaving slightly before disappearing around the bend. They didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. "Rusty!" The scream tore from Elias's throat, raw and terrified. He ran. He ran with a speed he hadn't possessed in 20 years, ignoring the ice, ignoring the fact that he was wearing slippers. He reached the road, his chest heaving, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. There were skid marks, there was a shattered piece of plastic from a headlight, and there was a trail of dark crimson smeared across the frosted asphalt, leading off the shoulder and down the steep embankment. The embankment led to what the locals called Devil's Drop, a jagged ravine filled with scree, thorn bushes, and bitter cold shadows. It was a place where livestock went to die, where the terrain was so unforgiving that even the coyotes hesitated to navigate it in the dark. Elias scrambled back to the house, his hands shaking so hard he could barely work the zipper of his boots. He grabbed his high-powered flashlight, the Winchester rifle he kept by the door, more out of habit than intent, and a coil of rope. "Hang on, buddy, I'm coming," he whispered, the guilt already settling in his gut like lead. It was the same guilt he felt when the officers came to his door about Lucas, the feeling of failing to protect the one thing he was entrusted with. The descent into Devil's Drop was a nightmare. The storm had arrived in earnest now, snow falling in thick, wet clumps that obscured vision and slicked the rocks. Elias slipped, sliding 10 feet down a gravel chute, tearing the skin on his palms, but he didn't feel the pain. He only felt the clock ticking. A dog as old as Rusty injured in this cold, shock would kill him before the blood loss did. He reached a ledge about 50 feet down. The beam of his flashlight cut through the swirling snow, sweeping the brush below. "Rusty, here, boy!" A whimper, faint, wet, and filled with pain. Elias swung the light toward the sound. Far below, caught in a tangle of dead roots at the base of a sheer drop, lay the golden form. Rusty was on his side, his breathing shallow, steam rising faintly from his body. His back leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. He looked small against the vast, indifferent darkness of the ravine. "I see you! I see you, Rusty!" Elias shouted, his voice cracking. He scanned the drop. It was too steep. He couldn't climb down directly without anchoring the rope, and there were no trees here, only loose rock. He would have to hike back up to the tree line, anchor the rope, and rappel down. It would take 20 minutes, maybe 30. "Don't you die on me," Elias hissed through gritted teeth, turning to scramble back up the slope. But then movement caught his eye. It wasn't Rusty. It was something else, moving with a fluid, ghostly silence along the bottom of the ravine. Elias froze, swinging the flashlight beam back down. At first he thought it was a coyote. The woods were full of them, and they were opportunistic scavengers. If a pack found Rusty now, it would be over in seconds. Elias raised the rifle, thumbing off the safety, his finger trembling on the trigger guard. But the creature that stepped into the circle of light wasn't a coyote. It was stockier, more muscular. It had a short bob tail and tufted ears that twitched as they caught the sound of the wind. Its coat was a mottled mix of gray and brown, perfectly camouflaged against the rocks. It was a bobcat, a large female. Elias knew this cat. He called her Mara. She was a phantom of this valley, known for her size and her unusual aggression. 2 winters ago, she had raided his coop, killing 3 hens not for food, but seemingly out of spite. He had spent weeks trying to trap her, but she was always smarter, always one step ahead. To Elias, she represented the cruel, unfeeling, chaotic nature of the wild, the very thing that took and never gave back. Now she was 10 feet from Rusty. The dog let out a low, terrified whine, trying to drag himself backward, but his broken body wouldn't cooperate. He collapsed, his head resting on the snow, exposing his throat. Mara paused. She looked up, her eyes reflecting the flashlight beam like 2 burning coins of gold. She didn't squint. She didn't run. She stared right at Elias, a look of chilling intelligence. "Get away!" Elias roared, firing a warning shot into the rocks well away from the animals. The crack of the rifle echoed violently, causing a mini avalanche of pebbles. Usually a bobcat would vanish at the sound of a gunshot. But Mara didn't bolt. She flinched, her ears flattening against her skull, but she held her ground. She looked at the thrashing, bleeding dog, and then back up at the man on the ridge. She took a step closer to Rusty. Elias racked the bolt, loading a fresh round. He was too high up, The angle was bad. If he shot now, he risked hitting the dog. Panic, cold and sharp, seized his chest. He was watching his son's dog about to be mauled by the creature he hated most in these woods, and the storm was screaming so loud he couldn't even hear Rusty's final cries. The flashlight beam flickered, the batteries dying in the extreme cold. In the dimming light, Elias saw the bobcat lower her head, opening her jaws inches from Rusty's neck. The light died. Darkness swallowed the ravine whole. "No!" Elias screamed into the void, fumbling blindly for the fresh batteries in his pocket, his fingers numb and useless, while down below, in the pitch black, the only sound was the wind and the rustle of something moving through the snow. Down in the gorge, the world had reduced itself to the primitive binary of predator and prey. When the light died, Rusty squeezed his eyes shut. The pain in his hip was a dull, throbbing fire that radiated up his spine, but the terror was colder and sharper. He could smell the musk of the wild cat, a scent of pine resin, dried blood from a previous kill, and the raw, metallic ozone of the storm. He felt the displacement of air as the creature moved closer. He braced for the tear of fangs, the end of the pain, but the bite never came. Instead, a coarse, wet roughness rasped against the fur of his neck. Rusty flinched, an involuntary spasm that racked his broken body. The bobcat, Mara, pulled back slightly, her whiskers twitching against the dog's ear. In the pitch black, her vision was a grainy monochrome, superior to any human technology. She saw the dog's dilated pupils, the tremors shaking his flank, and the unnatural angle of his rear leg. To Mara, the dog was an anomaly. He was Canis, a distant cousin to the coyotes that harassed her, and the wolves that would kill her without hesitation. Logic dictated she should leave him to the frost, or perhaps end him to silence the noise that might attract larger threats. But then Rusty let out a sound. It wasn't a bark or a growl. It was a high-pitched, mewling whimper, a sound of absolute helplessness. That sound struck a chord deep within Mara's brainstem, bypassing the predator's calculation and hitting the mother's instinct. 3 miles away, in a hollowed-out cottonwood stump, she had a litter of 3 kits, barely weaned. Her body was awash with hormones, oxytocin and prolactin, that wired her to respond to the distress cries of the young and the vulnerable. Rusty was old, gray-muzzled, and 80 pounds heavier than her kits, but in the dark, wounded and crying, he smelled of milk-warm fear. He was not a threat. He was a child in a giant's body. Mara lowered her head again. This time she didn't hesitate. She began to lick the matted fur around Rusty's wound. Her tongue was like sandpaper, efficient and rhythmic. She wasn't just comforting him, she was erasing the scent. The copper tang of fresh blood was a beacon in the night, a dinner bell for every scavenger in the valley. By cleaning him, she was cloaking him. Rusty's trembling began to subside. The rhythmic grooming was hypnotic, a primal sensation that recalled his earliest memories as a pup in a whelping box. His breathing hitched, then slowed. He didn't understand why the demon of the woods was nurturing him, but his worry accepted the truce. He exhaled a long, shuddering breath and let his heavy head drop onto his front paws. The storm, indifferent to this strange tableau, intensified. The wind howling through Devil's Drop shifted from a whistle to a roar, driving snow. Horizontally into the ravine, the temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. Mara stopped grooming. She shivered. Her winter coat was thick, designed for the Montana high country, but stationary exposure in this wind chill was deadly even for her. She looked at the dog. He was a massive radiator of heat. With a fluid grace, she circled him once, kneading the snow near his belly with her paws. Then she did the unthinkable. She curled herself into the curve of his stomach, pressing her back against his warm, furred underbelly. She tucked her nose under her tail to conserve warmth. Rusty stiffened for a second, surprised by the sudden weight and the heat of the wild animal pressing against his vital organs. But the warmth was undeniable. It seeped into his cold, stiffened joints. Slowly, carefully, he lowered his chin until it rested just inches from her tufted ears. There, in the bottom of the frozen hellscape, a domestic dog and a wild bobcat formed a single, breathing organism, a loaf of survival against the encroaching ice. 500 feet above, Elias Thorne was fighting his own war. "Damn it! Damn it! Damn it!" he cursed, his voice snatched away by the gale. His hands were numb blocks of wood as he fumbled with the flashlight casing. The batteries slipped from his fingers, tumbling into the snow. He fell to his knees, scrabbling frantically in the drifts, his fingers burning from the cold. He found one, then the other, wiping them on his coat before jamming them back into the cylinder. He smacked the flashlight against his palm. The beam flickered, sputtered, and then cut a weak yellow path through the driving snow. "I'm coming, Rusty," he gasped, coughing as the cold air seared his lungs. He moved to the edge of the drop. He couldn't rappel. He didn't have the harness, and his hands were too frozen to trust a grip on a slick rope. He would have to take the deer trail, a switchback path a half-mile down the ridge that wound its way to the valley floor. It would take time he didn't have, but he had to try. Every minute he delayed was a minute the bobcat had to finish what he assumed was a meal. He didn't know about the truce below. He only knew the law of the wild: the strong eat the weak. Elias shouldered his rifle and began to trudge through the knee-deep snow, heading for the trailhead. His mind played cruel tricks on him, replaying the sound of the gunshot, wondering if he had scared the cat off or if he had only angered it. Back in the ravine, the silence of the pact was broken. Mara's ears swiveled forward, independent of each other, like radar dishes locking onto a signal. Her eyes snapped open. She didn't move her body. Breaking the seal of warmth would be wasteful. But her muscles coiled, tense as steel springs under her loose skin. Rusty felt the change in her tension. He lifted his head, sniffing the air. At first, he smelled only the snow. Then he caught it. A muskier, dirtier scent than the cat. It smelled of wet dog, but sour, rotting. Out of the veil of falling snow, a shape materialized. It was smaller than a wolf, but lankier than a dog. Its coat was a patchy, mangy gray, and its tail hung low. It moved with a trot that was deceptively casual, its nose skimming the ground. A coyote. But not just any coyote. This was a scout. Elias would have recognized the gait. Trappers called them runners. They were the ones sent ahead of the pack to verify a kill or flush out prey. The coyote stopped 20 yards away, its yellow eyes fixed on the strange lump in the snow. It tilted its head, confused. It smelled the blood of the dog, rich and inviting, but it also smelled the cat. Predator. The mixture was confusing. The coyote took a tentative step forward, lips curling back to reveal yellowed canines. It let out a sharp, testing yip, a sound that echoed eerily off the rock walls. Rusty tried to scramble up, a growl rumbling deep in his chest, but his broken leg screamed in protest, collapsing him back into the snow. He was helpless. A sitting duck. The coyote saw the weakness. It lowered its head, emboldened. It took another step, then another, its pace quickening into a predatory lope. Wham! The snow exploded. Mara didn't just stand up. She launched herself. She was a blur of motion, covering the distance between Rusty and the threat in 2 bounds. She didn't retreat. She didn't climb a tree. She planted herself squarely between the crippled golden retriever and the advancing scavenger. She arched her back, her short tail twitching violently. And then she made a sound that no domestic dog could ever mimic. It wasn't a roar. It was a low, guttural saw blade of a sound, a growl that seemed to vibrate the very air. It started in her chest and ended in a hiss that exposed teeth far sharper and more specialized for killing than the coyote's. R-rah, hiss. The coyote skidded to a halt, its claws carving furrows in the ice. It had expected a helpless dog. It had not expected a 25-pound ball of fury guarding the meat. This was the red-eye, a name Elias had given to a particular large male coyote in the area, known for a scarred left eye. Red-eye wasn't easily spooked. He snapped his jaws, feinting a lunge to the left, testing the cat's reflexes. Mara didn't bite the bait. She swiped, a lightning-fast left hook with claws fully extended. The blow connected with the coyote's muzzle. Red-eye yelped, shaking his head as a line of bright red appeared on his nose. He backed up, sneezing. He looked at the cat, then past her at the helpless dog. The math wasn't adding up. Why was a bobcat defending a meal it wasn't eating? Red-eye snarled, a high-pitched sound of frustration. He wasn't going to fight a healthy bobcat alone, not when he had backup nearby. He turned tail and vanished into the whiteout as quickly as he had appeared. Mara didn't relax. She stayed standing, her hackles raised, her breath pluming in the cold air like dragon smoke. She knew canids. She knew they counted numbers. She turned back to Rusty. He was looking at her with wide, dark eyes. He gave a soft woof, a sound of gratitude. Mara didn't acknowledge it. She paced a tight circle around him, remarking the perimeter with her scent, claiming this ground, claiming this strange, broken creature as hers. She knew the scout would return, and he wouldn't be alone. The truce was over. The siege was about to begin. The truce in the ravine didn't break. It was shattered. It started with a sound that every rancher in the American West knows in their marrow, a sound that raises the hair on the back of the neck. It wasn't the lonely howl of a wolf nor the solitary bark of a fox. It was the chaotic, manic yipping of a pack gathering for a kill. It was a chorus of excitement, high-pitched and hysterical, echoing off the granite walls of Devil's Drop like a choir of the damned. Red-Eye had returned, and he hadn't come to negotiate. From the swirling whiteout of the storm, 5 distinct shapes materialized. They moved with the fluid coordination of a single entity, their gray coats matted with ice, their breath huffing in unison. These were not the scrawny scavengers of summer. These were winter-hardened opportunists, driven by the famine of the freeze. Mara, the bobcat, stood atop the heaving flank of Rusty like a gargoyle on a cathedral. She did not waste energy on noise. While the coyotes yipped and circled, whipping themselves into a frenzy, she remained absolutely still. Only her tail twitched, a short, spasmodic jerk. Her ears were pinned flat against her skull, transforming her silhouette into something streamlined and lethal. Rusty, sensing the shift in the air, tried to rise again. He let out a deep, chest-rumbling bark, a shadow of his former authority as a farm dog. But the effort cost him. His broken leg buckled, and he collapsed with a pained grunt. To the pack, this was the dinner bell. The attack didn't begin with a charge. It began with a nip. A young male coyote, eager and reckless, darted in from the left, snapping at Rusty's exposed tail. It was a test, a probe to check defenses. It was a mistake. Mara didn't lunge. She exploded. She didn't target the coyote's body. She targeted the eyes. With a hiss that sounded like a steam pipe bursting, she swiped, a blur of motion faster than the canine brain could process. Her claws, curved and razor-sharp, connected. The young coyote shrieked, tumbling backward into the snow, pawing at his face. The pack froze for a heartbeat. The dynamic had changed. This wasn't a scavenge. It was a war. Red Eye, the scarred alpha, barked a sharp command. The pack split. Two circled to the rear near Rusty's head, while Red Eye and another large female flanked the front. They were triangulating, using their numbers to stretch the Bobcat's defense until it snapped. Down the switchback trail, Elias Thorne heard the change in the wind. He was sliding more than walking, his boots losing purchase on the slate rock hidden beneath the snow. His breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning as if he'd inhaled glass. But over the roar of the blood in his ears, he heard it, the frantic yipping, the snarls, the scream of an animal in pain. "Hold on," he choked out, his voice raw. "Hold on, boy." He gripped the Winchester .30-30 lever-action rifle so hard his knuckles turned white. In his mind's eye, he didn't see a battle. He saw a massacre. He saw the Bobcat tearing at his son's dog, joined by the coyotes in a frenzy of feeding. The guilt he had been carrying since Lucas's funeral, the guilt of being the one who survived, the one who stayed behind, transmuted into a cold, hard rage. He wasn't just going to save a dog, he was going to punish the wild for its cruelty. He reached the bottom of the trail. The floor of the ravine was a chaotic theater of shadows and violence. Elias clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the snow, searching. What he saw stopped his heart. 10 yards away, in a clearing of trampled, bloody snow, lay Rusty. And standing directly on top of him was the Bobcat. Mara was unrecognizable. Her fur was matted with blood, some hers, some not. Her mouth was open in a permanent snarl, her fangs bared. She was panting heavily, her sides heaving. Surrounding her were the dark shapes of the coyotes, weaving in and out of the light like phantoms. From Elias's perspective, distorted by the snow, the adrenaline, and the poor angle, it looked like the Bobcat had claimed the kill and was defending its prize from the scavengers. He saw the blood on Rusty's neck, where Mara had groomed him earlier, and his mind filled in the horrific blanks. "Get away from him!" Elias roared, the sound tearing from his throat. He didn't think. He didn't assess. He acted on instinct, the protective instinct of a father who had already lost too much. He shouldered the rifle. The iron sights danced in the dim light. He couldn't risk hitting Rusty, so he aimed for the shoulder of the cat, the dark mass dominating the dog's body. Crack! The gunshot was deafening in the confined space of the ravine. It slapped against the canyon walls, momentarily drowning out the wind. The bullet didn't miss. Elias saw the impact. A tuft of fur erupted from Mara's left shoulder. The force of the round knocked the 20-pound cat backward, spinning her off Rusty's body and into the snow. "No!" Elias yelled again, racking the lever to chamber another round as he ran forward, flashlight swinging wildly. The coyotes, spooked by the thunder of the gun, scattered into the darkness, all except one. Red Eye was smart. He knew guns. He knew that humans focused on what was in front of them. While the other coyotes ran for the tree line, Red Eye had flattened himself into a depression in the snow, just to the right of where Elias was. Charging! Elias reached Rusty. He dropped to his knees, discarding the rifle in the snow. "Rusty? Rusty, buddy?" The dog was alive. He looked up at Elias, his eyes wide and confused. He wasn't looking at his master. He was looking past him, whining softly, trying to drag himself toward the spot where the Bobcat had fallen. Elias checked the dog's neck, expecting to find a torn throat. There was nothing. No bite marks, no gushing wound, just the wet, matted fur where the cat had cleaned him. Elias froze. His hands, covered in Rusty's drool, stopped moving. A cold realization began to seep into his brain, sharper than the wind. The blood on the snow. It wasn't Rusty's. It was coyote blood. Growl. The sound came from behind him, close, too close. Elias spun around, reaching for the rifle he had foolishly dropped 3 feet away. Red-Eye launched. The alpha coyote had seen the opening. The man was on his knees, distracted, his back exposed. It was a crime of opportunity. Red-Eye aimed for the forearm, for the meat that would disable the threat. Elias threw his arm up, bracing for the bite, a scream building in his throat. But the bite never landed. A blur of gray and brown intercepted the coyote in midair. It was Mara. She had been shot. Her left shoulder was a ruin of red muscle and shattered bone, the leg dragging uselessly. But she hadn't run. She hadn't fled into the safety of the dark. With a scream of pure, unadulterated fury, the 3-legged cat collided with the coyote. It wasn't a fight for territory. It wasn't a fight for food. It was a fight for the pack she had chosen. She latched onto Red-Eye's neck with a death grip, her back legs, the good one and the bad one flailing, raking at the coyote's belly. The size difference was significant. The coyote outweighed her by 20 pounds, but the ferocity was unmatched. Red-Eye yelped, a sound of genuine terror. He thrashed, trying to dislodge the demon clinging to his throat, but Mara was dead weight and sharp edges. She rode him like a bronco, driving him away from the man and the dog. Elias sat stunned, the flashlight beam illuminating the struggle. He watched as the creature he had just shot, the creature he had hunted and hated for years, put her body between him and the predator. Red-Eye realized the cost was too high. He managed to shake Mara loose, sending her tumbling into a snowdrift. He didn't wait for a second round. Whimpering, bleeding from a dozen scratches, the alpha turned and bolted into the night, his tail tucked firmly between his legs. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Elias scrambled forward, not to Rusty this time, but to the small, heaving pile of fur in the snowdrift. Mara lay on her side. Her breathing was wet and ragged. The exit wound on her shoulder was bad. Blood pumped rhythmically onto the white powder, staining it a shocking crimson. Elias reached out a hand, then hesitated. This was a wild animal. A wounded, cornered wild animal. But Mara didn't hiss. She didn't swipe. She lifted her head, her movement slow and heavy. She looked at Elias. Her golden eyes were dimming, the fire dampening, but the intelligence was still there. She looked at him, and then she looked past him, toward Rusty. She gave a soft, chuffing sound, a sound mothers make to their kits. Elias felt a tear freeze on his cheek. He looked at the gun lying in the snow, then at his hands. "Oh, God," he whispered, his voice breaking into a sob. "Oh, God, what have I done?" He stripped off his heavy canvas coat. He didn't care about the cold anymore. He moved slowly, talking in a low, steady drone. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, girl. I didn't know. I didn't know." He approached her. Mara watched him. She tensed as his hand came close, her ears flattening. But as he laid the heavy coat over her, trapping the heat, she didn't bite. She was too tired. And perhaps in that strange, wordless way that animals understand intent, she knew the war was over. Elias scooped her up, coat and all. She was surprisingly light, a compact bundle of muscle and grit. He held her against his chest with his left arm, feeling her rapid, thready heartbeat against his own. He turned to Rusty. "Can you move, old man?" Elias asked, his voice thick with emotion. "We've got a long walk, and we've got a debt to pay." Rusty whined and dragged himself up on 3 legs. He limped to Elias's side, nudging the bundle in his arms with his nose. The procession began. A man carrying the enemy he had shot, followed by the dog she had saved, climbing out of the devil's throat and into the unforgiving night. The storm raged on, but the hatred in Elias's heart had been replaced by a terrifying, desperate hope that he hadn't just killed the only miracle he'd seen in 20 years. The drive to Doc Miller's clinic was a blur of white lines and black ice. Elias drove the old Ford with one hand on the wheel and the other pressing a towel against the Bobcat's shoulder, while Rusty wheezed in the back seat. The heater rattled, fighting a losing battle against the Montana winter, but Elias was sweating. Doc Miller was a woman cut from the same rough cloth as the land itself. She was 70, with hands gnarled by arthritis but steady as a surgeon's. She didn't ask questions when Elias kicked open the door of her practice at 3:00 a.m. carrying a wild predator wrapped in a blood-soaked Carhartt coat. She just pointed to the metal table. "Stabilize the dog in the kennel," she ordered. Her voice clipped. "Put the cat here, and for the love of God, Elias, don't let her wake up before I get the sedative in." The next 2 hours were an exercise in purgatory. Elias sat in the waiting room, staring at a faded poster of a horse skeleton. The adrenaline had crashed, leaving him hollowed out. He replayed the gunshot in his mind over and over, the crack of the rifle, the tumble of the cat. When the door finally opened, the sun was just beginning to bleed gray light over the mountains. Doc Miller looked tired. She wiped her hands on a rag and sat down opposite Elias. "They're both alive," she said. Elias let out a breath he felt he'd been holding since the ravine. "And?" "The dog, Rusty. He's got a fractured hip and severe exhaustion. But here's the thing, Elias. He should be dead. Hypothermia should have taken him hours before you got there." She leaned forward, her eyes sharp. His core temp was low, but not critical. Someone, or something, was keeping him warm. Elias nodded slowly. "She curled up with him. I saw the tracks." "Well, she did more than that," Miller continued. "I pulled coyote fur out of that cat's claws." "And the dog?" "Not a single bite mark on him. That Bobcat took on a pact to protect your boy." She paused, looking at the floor. "The bullet went through the cat's shoulder, through and through, missed the bone by a fraction of an inch. Muscle damage, blood loss. But she's tough. She'll heal." "Can she go back?" Elias asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. "Not yet. Not with this storm, and not with that shoulder. She needs 2 weeks, maybe 3. But Elias, she's wild. You can't domesticate a storm." The next 3 weeks were a strange season in the Thorne household. Rusty lay on his orthopedic bed by the wood stove, his hip pinned and healing, thumping his tail whenever Elias walked by. In the barn, inside a reinforced large dog run, lived Mara. Elias didn't try to tame her. He didn't talk to her in baby talk. He went in twice a day to change her bandages and leave fresh meat, roadkill deer or raw beef. She would hiss, retreating to the back of the cage, her eyes burning with that unquenchable yellow fire. She hated the cage. She hated the smell of man. And Elias respected that. He respected her hate because it meant her spirit wasn't broken. He felt a debt to her that couldn't be paid in kibble. Every time he looked at Rusty, hobbling around the kitchen, he saw the ghost of his son smiling back. The cat hadn't just saved a dog, she had saved the last piece of Elias's heart. By the time the Chinook winds came, melting the snow into slush, Mara was pacing. Her limp was gone. She was throwing herself against the mesh, desperate for the timberline. "It's time," Elias told Rusty one morning. He loaded the crate onto the truck bed. He drove her back to the logging road, not far from Devil's Drop, but far enough from the road to be safe. He opened the tailgate. The morning air was crisp, smelling of pine sap and wet earth. Elias stood back and unlatched the crate door. "Go on then," he whispered. "You're free. And thank you." Mara didn't look back. There was no Disney moment, no pausing to nod in gratitude. She exploded from the crate like a cannonball, a streak of brown and gray that vanished into the underbrush instantly. 1 second she was there, a captive. Next, she was a part of the forest again. Elias stood there for a long time, listening to the silence, feeling lighter than he had in years. 6 months later. Summer hit the valley hard, turning the meadows into a riot of wildflowers. The air buzzed with crickets, and the evenings stretched out long and golden. Elias sat on his porch, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand. Rusty was at his feet. The dog walked with a permanent hitch in his gait now, a war wobble, as Elias called it, but his eyes were bright. The sun was dipping below the peaks, casting long shadows across the yard. Elias was about to head inside to start supper when Rusty lifted his head. The dog's ears pricked up. He gave a soft, low woof, not a warning, but a greeting. Elias followed the dog's gaze toward the edge of the tree line where the manicured grass met the wild scrub. At first he saw nothing but shadows. Then the shadows moved. She stepped out into the golden light. Mara. She looked different. Her coat was sleek, her summer fur lighter, shedding the gray of winter for a tawny gold. The scar on her shoulder was visible, a patch of white fur where the hair had grown back differently, a badge of the night at Devil's Drop. She wasn't alone. Behind her, stumbling over a fallen log, were 2 kittens. They were balls of fluff with oversized paws and curious blue eyes. They tumbled into the grass, batting at a butterfly, completely oblivious to the danger of the open space. Mara stopped. She sat down on her haunches, wrapping her tail around her paws. She looked directly at the porch. She looked at the man, and she looked at the dog. Elias stayed frozen. He barely breathed. He knew what this was. In the wild, you don't bring your vulnerable young to a place unless you know in your blood, that it is safe. It was the ultimate act of trust, a treaty signed not with ink, but with presence. Rusty thumped his tail once, hard against the deck. Mara blinked, a slow, deliberate closing of her eyes. Then she let out a soft chirrup. The kitten scrambled back to her side. She stood up, turned, and melted back into the tree line, the forest swallowing them as if they had never been there. Elias let out a long, shaky breath. He reached down and rested his hand on Rusty's head, scratching behind the ears just the way Lucas used to. "You were right, son," Elias whispered to the empty air, a smile finally reaching his eyes. "It's not just a cruel world out there. It's a good one, too." The sun finally slipped behind the mountain, but the darkness didn't feel heavy anymore. The woods were no longer filled with monsters. They were filled with neighbors. And somewhere out there, watching over the valley, was a sentinel with a scar on her shoulder, keeping the pact alive. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.